All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the first, I guess you would say, inaugural podcast of Civil Weird.
Shouldn't we call it the second, since the first one was a flop?
Yeah, it was a flop.
We'll call it the first.
Well, I wouldn't even call that one the first one. I would say that one was the 0.01.
Fair enough. I'll take it.
I got a feeling we're gonna have to, do some decimals for this.
We may even have to go to version 3. Who knows?
Yeah, you never know. Well, I guess we should introduce ourselves. My name is Adam Krall, and with me is my faithful co-host, and I guess you would say my what would you say, Paul?
Attaché?
Yeah,
is that the right word?
Like
yeah.
I am the $1 million man to his Virgil, if you will, if you like wrestling.
Sure, fair enough. Oh, wow. That's bringing back memories for sure. Yeah. Now, before we go on, I do want to say that tonight's episode is sponsored by a historic word, obsolete word, miasmas. Vaporous exhalations killing people since the 1600s.
Oh, man. I remember the last time I had miasmas.
Yeah, the cause of any death, right?
Yeah.
In the 19th century.
Sure. If, you're walking by a swamp, and, there's some swamp gas, if you will, coming out of it.
Exhalations, vaporous.
Yeah.
Vaporous.
That's another good one. That is another good
Everyone
one.
died of miasmas.
Vaporous miasmas.
Even that woman of the night, you died of her miasmas.
She did.
Yeah.
It wasn't the gonorrhea that she gave you or, any other numerous items.
Yeah, well.
But anyway, I guess we should get into part of our topic for this evening. And our topic is Sergeant Boston Corbett, or as Paul likes to call him, Sergeant Boston.
Corbett.
He's
European. He is European.
He is
Sophisticated.
English. He's English, but we are going with the churched up and the anglicized version.
Well, Boston comes later. He starts out as what? Thomas. Corbett, if you will.
English, very, very English. Comes over from, I think he's born in London.
He is born in London, 1832, if memory serves.
Yes, and comes over with his mother and father and siblings to the New World to get a new start in 1832, which at the time they more than likely were going to Massachusetts, to Lowell, to the mills.
Is a possibility. I do know they moved to Troy, New York briefly as well in his childhood.
Yes, and which was another planned industrial complex for new workers.
Absolutely.
But for them to come over at the height of the Industrial Revolution in England to here, obviously seemed the grass was greener on the other side of the pond. Yeah,
sure. And he's like him and his family are like a lot of European immigrants at that time. It's really hard. Not much is known about Thomas's childhood. I mean, to be blatantly honest, we know based on the 1840 census that the family was already in the United States. But other than that, it's really hard to confirm, honestly, childhood statistics.
Sure. And if we go off of, any kind of previous evidence of English or even Irish immigrants that came here, specifically English, though, I'm sure that they probably moved around quite a bit. If they were in Troy, New York, if wherever you could go, wherever you could find the work. And so obviously, who knows if they knew how to read or write. And if they came here and they didn't leave any really, hard written records about their family life, then what can you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we do know by the 1850s, Thomas Corbett, not quite Boston yet, right? That comes a little later.
Not quite.
Not quite Boston. In the 1850s, he's working in the millinery industry. For those of you who aren't familiar with that word, hat making.
Another archaic vocab.
Oh yeah, like the apothecary.
That's right. Go to the apothecary. Yeah, so, he's a hat maker. He's a hatter.
He's making hats for predominantly fur, for sure. Most better made hats are fur versus wool. Mm-hmm. And at that time, unfortunately, that industry involved a lot of caustic materials.
Yeah, he used mercury on a daily basis. The mercury was used to smooth out the pelt.
Yeah, the felting process of it. Yeah, it opens up the microscopic fibers of your animal hairs.
Yeah.
It allows them to bind and lock together for that strong felting material that is required for a well-made hat.
Yeah.
Great. And those who are at least have had a chemistry high school class know that would understand that mercury is harmful. But in the 19th century, mercury was like a cure-all. They were given mercury, derivatives of mercury as a medicine to some patients who suffered from everything from constipation to fevers. They were administering mercury sulfites, things of that nature. But as we now know today, I mean, it causes some not healthy neuropsychotic behaviors, anxiety, emotional incontinence,
which is I wouldn't say it's a new term, but it is a very now prevalent term in the public lexicon, which is forever chemical. It never leaves your body.
You can't get it out. Yeah, that is correct.
Ever. And that was one of the ways, not only with him handling the mercury itself by using it to smooth the pellets and everything, one of the processes was them heating the mercury. And so not only was he getting it through direct skin contact, which it seeps into pores, but he was also getting it through the air.
Oh, like a miasma, maybe?
Miasma, absolutely. A vile miasma.
Yeah, vaporous.
Absolutely. But yeah, absolutely. That was another way that he was getting it. And day in, day out, constantly using those chemicals are, it's going to affect the brain.
Yeah. They had a phrase that was a common to hat makers. They called it hatter's shakes.
Yes.
Yeah. I almost forgot about that phrase until I started researching Thomas a little more. So sure. Yeah, definitely.
And of course the common phrase, mad as a hatter.
Mad as a hatter.
And that is, that has been around since the profession was even begun because of the effect that those chemicals had on.
Sure.
Stopping.
All right. Yeah. So he is definitely working in that industry in the 1850s, and perhaps by the late 1850s, the signs of mercury begin to show. From what we know, from what we can see, from the evidence that is left behind.
Yes.
So what's going on? I'd say 1858 or so, late 1850s, we see a change in old Thomas.
He's still working. I mean, he's a constant employee.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And he's
New York, Troy still. I know he was doing that work in Troy.
Yep. Richmond, Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland, Boston, New York.
He stuck with it. So he probably was a pretty decent hatter. By then he's already gone through apprenticeship, if any.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I would say that, his ability to create, unique creations as a hatter, he was probably not only an artisan, but he was an artist. And I'm sure that he probably created some wonderful headwear, but the problems with his, his profession and his drinking tend to take its toll.
Hey, don't judge us.
No, nobody's judging anybody who drinks. But when your brain is already Swiss cheese from the chemicals that you've been playing with, the alcohol tends to go through it a little bit faster.
Is that from Quantum Leap? Or?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Al was there. Anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, he is in Richmond around this time. He's married. Mm-hmm. His wife is pregnant. And they decide that they would. Nobody really knows for sure. He was either let go from a job in Richmond. He either quit the job in Richmond so they could go back north and have the child in New York or Boston. But either way, they leave the city.
Right. Well, there was a breaking point.
Yes.
For soon to be Boston. Correct. Yes. His wife dies in childbirth. Correct.
Yes. And the child also dies.
Yeah. Correct.
They get to Boston and they get off the boat, and she and the child are buried in Boston. And Thomas Corbett at this time decides to take to the bottle. And he not only takes to the bottle, but he is a fall down, uncontrollable drunk. And he wanders about the city, causing trouble, getting in fights, drunk all the time, until he wanders in front of a Salvation Army home.
Oh, yeah. And to quote himself, this is where he first saw the light.
He saw the light. I saw the light. He saw the light. And for lack of a, I guess you would say, better term, the Salvation Armyists, if you want to call them that.
Was it the Salvation Army at the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was.
I guess I'm not well read on that organization that early in American history. So
no, it was the Salvation Army, and he happened to wander in front of the wrong prayer meeting, and they saw him staggering on the street drunk. They walked outside, and basically they kidnapped him.
Common practice, sure. Yeah.
And it was for them. They were very pro-temperance. Not just pro-temperance, but very anti-alcohol.
I'll drink to that.
Right? Amen. And so they kidnapped him. They brought him inside, and as a unfunctional alcoholic,
You meaning unemployed?
Yeah, pretty much. He he became what any alcoholic in that situation would be, which is he went into withdrawals. Had a supposed vision of the Lord coming.
So it was that bad to where he was having the tremors.
And there isn't a lot of reference material from the Salvation Army or anybody really.
Sure, yeah.
In regards to what happened.
Hard to confirm it, but you could assume.
But a couple weeks later, Thomas is back on the street, and he is not Thomas any longer. He is now Boston.
Boston, after his, we already mentioned it, where he saw the light. He changed his name.
And it was a Methodist, a devout Methodist conversion.
Methodist Episcopal, right, is where he went. Yeah.
Very, very street preacher-esque.
He may have taken it a little too strongly at first. I mean, didn't he get the nickname the Glory to God Man? Yes. I think it is what people started calling him, the Glory to God Man. Yeah.
He would just put a chair on the corner,
right?
Or if he had access to a small ladder or otherwise, but his pulpit was the street,
right? And although, I mean, he was never formally a pastor by any means. He didn't have any theology training. None. So it's strictly lay. And even at today's standards, that would be a bit unusual, to be honest with you, to go out and start preaching your tracts to a community where you're not even, a minister by those rights. So.
Sure. And like you said, even in today's era, or I guess you would say today's standard, anybody that is, taking time out of their day to stand on a street corner and tell passersby that they are sinners or they're going to hell,
burning in hell for all eternity. Yeah.
And, that tends to weird a crowd out.
It does. Yeah. It could rub some individuals wrong. Yes.
And hence why Boston is on this first inaugural podcast.
I guess really the first weird aspect of his life is in July of 1858, right? Now he's already taken on the name Boston.
Yes.
He's already converted, as it were,
and still cannot hold a job. But now the religious aspect is
he has a run-in with a couple of prostitutes in 1858, July 16th, 1858. They know the date, which is scary. Questionable, I guess. I don't know. I'd have to research that more. I've seen a couple of sources said July 16th.
Sure. As Dr. Devin Hunter would say, or his daughter would say, questionable historiography. The date, I would say, is noteworthy and was taken down for what he did. Boston runs into the two prostitutes, and when he runs into the prostitutes, he's
living in Boston. By this time, he is becoming a strong convert. I mean, by this time he is definitely deep into absolutely. But something interesting happens on July 16th, 1858. Now, if that date's confirmed, I'm not entirely sure, but several articles and resources I've read for some reason states that date. He has a run-in with a couple of prostitutes. What was the word you used? Harlots, yeah.
Ladies of the
I guess
evening.
hookers wasn't quite like a thing yet.
Not until 1861 when
thank you, General Hooker.
Young general decided to take his place with the ladies of the evening. But
good for him.
Yeah,
No, he has a run-in with prostitutes. Now, sources vary. He may have had frequent interludes with harlots prior to that point in his life. Something happens on this day, though. We don't really know what, but
I think he may have been out in the street and probably doing what he was wont to do, which was street preach and damn people all across the city. And I think that he may have been in a section of Boston where there may have been some sex workers, and these ladies decided to, I don't know, try to tempt young Boston.
Right. Sex workers is the modern term we're supposed to use nowadays, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm trying to
still, sex workers, prostitutes, whatever, people, ladies plying their trade.
Right. Making money, paying their way through college, right?
Yeah, absolutely. From what I understand, though, and what I guess I could hypothesize is that he was preaching and they got tired of hearing it, and they decided to go and titillate Boston. And
that could have been it.
I think that's what happened.
Let's go see what we can make this man do.
Sure. And I think he got a little bit excited, and I think that he had some questions of faith at that point.
Oh, yeah. And I would love to own the pair of scissors that he used. So if you know of the pair of scissors, by all means, reach out to me. I'd be willing to pay probably up to $100 for these scissors, but he gets tempted by these women of the night.
Yes.
And he feels guilty about it. He's a converted man now. And he decides
the Spirit of the Lord.
Yeah, he decides maybe on the extreme side to, take a pair of scissors and remove his testicles.
Yes.
He castrates himself.
Yes, he does. He decides after this unfortunate meeting with the young ladies that if he can't stop himself from being tempted or succumbing to temptation, then he'll, as they say, nip the problem in the bud. And he didn't nip it in the bud. He nipped it in the bag.
Now, I'd like to say he had some pretty big kahunas, but I knew that's not true now. But so he goes back to his residence. He castrates himself.
Yeah.
Without proper medical procedure by any means. I mean, he's using a pair of sewing shears for all intents and purposes. But he goes out and he has dinner, right? He goes out and has dinner,
runs errands,
runs some errands, takes a little time to pray at his church. This could have been hours before seeking medical attention.
And it was. It absolutely was. So he goes after he does the deed. He decides that that's not just good enough to cut his own balls off. He decides that he needs to throw them in the garbage.
Oh.
So he cuts his balls off and then throws them in the garbage.
Oh, yeah. Bobby would be proud.
Absolutely. But this is where the story gets weirder, if you can imagine. He decides that after he does this, as Paul said, he goes out, he runs a few errands, he does some street preaching, and he decides to sit down and have himself a meal at a tavern. Has the meal, and of course, has to go to his daily prayer meeting at the Methodist Church, and
probably bleeding out by now. I doubt. Well, who knows the details
from the record of what was taken down the evening that, and as I said, the evening of the incident, because he had done this earlier in the day. He goes to the church, and there happens to be a doctor, a surgeon there, who's a part of the congregation, and he sees the blood stain, and he coolly and calmly asks Boston if there's something wrong, and he says, "No, I've fixed the problem. There is
I couldn't
nothing
imagine.
wrong anymore."
I've not been in church and had to ask anyone that.
No,
hey,
no,
buddy, old pal.
Oh, that's a bad day. That's a bad Sunday, Tuesday. Anything that ends in A.
right. Bad start to a day any day.
Right. And the doctor asked him to come to the back of the church. He does. He takes a look at the butchery that's gone on.
I could only imagine.
And he says to Boston that this needs to be fixed as best I can, at least to stop the bleeding, because he's, he might not be bleeding out, but he's bleeding pretty bad.
Oh, yeah.
The doctor puts a poultice of some sort on the wound, and they walk a few blocks to this doctor's office where he brings him in. He gets a better look at the wound.
He's a man's man.
Absolutely. And from the written record of this doctor, he says that it was not a good job. His interior area of his scrotum was hanging out, vas deferens, everything was there except for the testicles.
Hanging out like octopus tentacles.
Yeah, exactly. Looking for a friend. And so the doctor, without anesthesia, he cleans up the wound by taking off the material and tells Corbett that this is permanent. There's nothing that can be done.
Oh, yeah. And you might even die from this, probably. Absolutely. I would assume so, yeah.
There's still a possibility of sepsis.
Oh, sepsis for sure, yeah. Blood poisoning, oh, yeah.
But Corbett is absolutely pleased with what's occurred, and he says, no, he goes, this won't be a problem anymore because these won't be here to be a problem. And so from that point forward, he is a castrata.
A eunuch, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. Castrata, eunuch. I don't think his singing voice went up at all, but I have a feeling his singing voice might have not gone up, but I got a feeling that he became a little bit more shrill and a little bit more annoying.
Maybe more angry. Yeah. Well, surprisingly, he survives his self mutilation, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And he serves as a soldier in the American Civil War. And we're going to get into that here because it definitely leads into more weirdness, I guess, hence Civil War weird. We do know that his military career was hit or miss. He had 3 separate enlistments in the Civil War.
Yeah,
for sure. So early in his career, he seems, going back to the hit or miss, maybe little insubordinate, but by the end of the war, he actually might show to be a pretty decent soldier.
Yeah, his record, even though there is some, I guess you would say, spotty service,
derogatory information.
Yeah, derogatory. He was not only a good soldier and was good at his job, being a cavalryman and early in the war an infantryman, but his comrades spoke nothing but praise of him. Of course, they had problems here and there, but the I guess you would say the performance that he put up as a cavalryman during the Civil War was exceptional.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, he starts out in 1861 and he joins the 12th New York Militia. It was an early war 90-day infantry organization, which, if you're any kind of a student of the Civil War, you know that most of the organizations in April of 1861 were simple 90-day militia call-ups. So do we know if he was part of a city militia prior to that, or he just joined after Sumter? Did you see any documents on that?
No, I think that I don't think he was in a militia unit, as New York was where he was playing a straight at the time. And they had several excellent militia units. 69th, I can't recall what their militia designation was, but no, he was not.
Anyway, he does find himself in that 12th New York Militia, which was this was a time of the war where, unless you had any sense, most of America thought it has to be done pretty quick, right?
Yeah.
That was the assumption. So, yeah. Except for those like, Sherman, who dwelled on the fact that he was trying to say that this war was going to go on forever.
And was deemed insane.
Yeah. Even insane. But he joins one of those typical 90-day groups, ends up in Washington, D.C. And 90 days, what are you going to do in 90 days? They're mustered out. at that 90-day point without seeing any action. However, so that was enlistment number one. However, it appears that after that, that New York militia was mustered out, an overwhelming majority of those 12th New York soldiers opted to re-enlist.
Yes.
And that's exactly what he did. So they re-enlisted into, I was getting designations confused. He re-enlists into the 12th New York militia again, but they really end up folding into the 12th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Yeah. Combat-wise, when he was in the 12th, are you tracking on anything? I know they were down in Harper's Ferry briefly.
Yes.
What action did they see down there?
Nothing.
Nothing.
They were at Harper's Ferry.
Probably a guard detail.
Yeah, they were protecting the armory. And, of course, Harper's Ferry is a relative crossroads for that section of Virginia to go north, south, east, or west. But they basically did guard duty. They protected the rails. Ran off some guerrillas, but really, nothing of true note.
Okay. Who was his commander at the time?
Abner Doubleday.
Well, at that time, who was the commander of the original 12th militia? That was Butterfield, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And this is where we kind of run into his, going back to what I said earlier, he's hit or miss with his military career, right? So,
Nope. So yeah, we're now, I guess we're back in New York, or we're still at Harper's Ferry. So at Harper's Ferry, the 12th gets into it a little bit. They happen to be there on the rather ignominious day of the largest American surrender up until the Philippines.
Yellow Belly.
12,000 Union soldiers were turned over to the vaunted Stonewall Jackson and his men, who were headed north to join up with his boss, Robert E. Lee, and the Army of Northern Virginia, who was taking a stand or trying to head a little bit further north near Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. So he was there. 50 men were wounded and killed on both sides in that small skirmish, including the commander of the Union forces there at Harper's Ferry. And he was most likely wounded by a cannonball fired by a Union battery, because they didn't see the point in surrendering, but he did, and he didn't live too much longer. And after that, Boston and his comrades, all 12,000, were paroled after Jackson took every single musket that they had, and they were sent back to New York.
Yeah, so they're all captured. They're on parole. So by the rights of parole, they're not
a gentleman's agreement.
A gentleman's agreement, not really allowed to serve in the military beyond that point, right?
No, they're done. They should go home and
yeah.
Go back to their plows.
So talk about a bumpy 12th New York history, honestly. It's court-martialed because of the Butterfield insults, and then he's captured and paroled at Harper's Ferry, gets sent back home. The 12th has a very, being an Illinois boy and knowing our Illinois units, the 12th New York has an interesting history. So
checkered,
a little checkered, different, hard to track. Let's call it that. Yeah.
Hard to track, hard to put in.
Whatever existed of the 12th. Now this is the 12th beyond their 90 days. This was that new 12th. They mustered out. They became the new 12th Volunteer. They kind of folded into one 12th New York Regiment, right? Yeah. They're captured at Harper's Ferry, but then they're all paroled home. And to me, if I was paroled, I guess I don't owe an obligation to the military.
So especially when I've been told I can go home.
Yeah, right. So Boston is part of that capture / pardon.
Yeah. Yeah,
he's been captured twice, technically. We'll get into that, though, later.
Sure.
Ends up back in New York and is probably doing what any paroled soldier would do, doing his own thing, maybe trying to find a new career, trying to figure out where he's going next. But then the 12th is called back into service again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which makes sense. You know, whatever. What do the Confederates have on us? I'm going to Hey guys, you want to serve again? We kind of need you right now, right?
Sure, exactly right. Especially in those months of 1863, has been referred to.
They're called back up because of Lee's invasion again, right? His second invasion of the North. Sure. Yeah.
Incursion into Pennsylvania, which would culminate in the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg. But they're called back up and they're sent to Harrisburg. To watch the roads north in case Lee and his army decides that they're going to turn northeast and decide to go towards Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, which had already been attacked and ransomed by Jeb Stuart and his cavalry. But they go to Harrisburg. They see no action there.
The recalled 12th.
Yep, the recalled 12th. They see no action. And once the Gettysburg, I guess you would say, scare is over with, they're recalled back to New York. And not only recalled back to New York, but they're called back to New York to help put down the draft riots.
Yeah, I really hate to bring Hollywood into this. You know, you and I both agree that if you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, then hopefully you have learned that there were legitimate draft riots in New York City right around the time of Gettysburg. 1863, the American Civil War, there were a lot of people who were becoming maybe wary of the war and weren't quite.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there
in the draft rights are portrayed in that movie. Yeah,
absolutely. And he was not. They don't really give a number to the Union regiment that comes into the 5 points and fires on the crowd. But Corbett was living near the 5 points at that point, previous to his call up. And so he would have known the area very well. However, they did not make it back to New York in time to, I guess you would say, participate in putting down the riots. They came several days after, but they did see the aftermath of it. They were quartered at City Hall. And then after that, they were mustered out once again.
Twice. Yeah. Right. And then we find by August of 63?
Yeah. August of 63. Corbett had registered as an eligible draftee earlier that year. And instead of being drafted, there was yet another regiment being formed in New York City. And he joined what became the 16th New York Cavalry, Volunteer Cavalry, and he was in Company L of that regiment. And the light action that he saw with the 12th throughout his, I guess you would say, 2.5 years of previous service, minus his interludes in New York and other places while he was not in service, he would see extensive action in Northern Virginia with that regiment.
Boy, I'm questioning coming from England into the New England states. Where did he learn to ride a horse, I wonder?
That's another question, because
really that's a big jump.
Sure. And most of the cavalry units in the Civil War recruited men who were able horsemen.
Yeah. Interesting. And I don't think we have the documents on that, but
no, but still, you're right. I don't know. Maybe he got tired of walking.
Fair enough. Enough. Yeah.
That's one of the things I look at it is that,
2 years of marching around does get, and I wouldn't want to do it.
Yeah, no. But yeah, he decides to trade in his brogans for a saddle. So
right about now, when he joins the 16th, we're looking at 3 enlistments for the Civil War alone, which
which at this point he did
which is above average, to be honest, in 1863. Right. Yeah.
He had no reason other than, I guess you would say, his own personal beliefs of the reason why he was going back for a third enlistment. Like I said, there was no reason for him to go back for a third time. Most men, after even their 90 days, they had seen enough. Mm-hmm. As they said, they never saw the elephant, but they saw enough of the monkey show, and mother, I don't want to see no more. Yeah. But for him to go back and join a force that he seems to be completely alien to, is interesting as hell to me. I don't understand why he would do that, other than, like, we have researched and read that he said that he thought that the Civil War was a war bestowed by God, and slavery was an evil that had to be crushed. Mm-hmm. And that is the only thing that I can think of the reason why he would go back.
Yeah, so he's serving with the 16th New York Cavalry, close to a year, right? Service mm-hmm. down south. Primarily what cavalry is used for during the Civil War: reconnaissance, screening, But what happens in June of 1864? He's captured.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're out hunting Mosby's raiders, which was one of their primary jobs, was to keep guerrilla bands, primarily Mosby, and his men, who were, I guess you would say, the cream of the crop of guerrilla bands in Northern Virginia, but several other ones as well. He and 10 men are out on a patrol looking for trouble, and looking to keep the rebels off the supply lines, for General Grant. And they run into a force that is outnumbering them. But Boston Corbett, being the warrior, I guess you would say, that he was, they get into a firefight with this opposing force.
His time with the 12th doesn't exactly show that. I think his real military exemplary behavior shows up with the 16th.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And in this firefight, the written accounts from Confederates and his own comrades state that Boston was the last man to surrender. He fired every single round that he had for his carbine and his pistol. And when they were told to come out and surrender, Corbett stood up and threw his pistol and then threw his carbine at the Confederates, and they cheered him. They told him that they didn't want to kill him and they didn't want to kill anybody else, so surrender. And begrudgingly, Corbett and his comrades threw up their hands and they came out. And from that point, for about a year, he was in a living hell.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Quite a few months he was in that living hell. I didn't have time to research this, but there was an interesting story about him moving south. So he's captured, right? He gave all hell, right? He wasn't going to go down easy, but he is captured by the Confederacy, and it happened to a lot. He's being moved south.
Sure. And I will say that, I guess we should maybe put this in here, is that it was not uncommon in especially May, June, July, August, up until September of 1864, when the Overland Campaign was in full swing, for numerous Union soldiers, whether they be cavalry, artillery, or infantry.
Thousands.
And they were captured for any number of reasons. You have the instances where where Corbett and his cavalry.
He's in Tennessee, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. He's over there.
Enjoy the humor of the show.
So you have Corbett and his comrades who get into a firefight and they begrudgingly surrender, or you have any number of hundreds of troops a day that fall out of a march to take a piss.
Stragglers.
Yeah. To relieve themselves, to do any number of things in the dark. And by the time they get done doing or fiddling with whatever they're doing, their unit's gone.
Oh, yeah.
And the worst thing you could have happen to you in that area of Virginia at the time in that absolute jungle of a second growth forest was to fall behind and the Confederates would take you.
Oh, yeah.
And so Corbett, just like many other numbers of Union soldiers from the Army of the Potomac, ended up in that same position.
Absolutely. Yeah. One account I read, he was moving south as a prisoner of war. And him and up to possibly as many as 2,000 other POWs end up near Macon, Georgia. And they're there for several nights.
Yes.
As they're consolidating prisoners.
Newly captured Yankees.
Yeah. And at this time of the war, the Confederacy's, they can barely feed their own men,
Sure,
let alone
absolutely.
trying to figure out how they can provide, for all these prisoners coming from the north. But they're in the vicinity of Macon, Georgia. 2,000 prisoners, give or take, are rounded up in a temporary storage area. Lack of a better word, what would you call it? Storage area sounds.
Stockade.
A holding area, a pen.
Stockade,
Yeah.
which I would assume was
storage.
nothing.
They all had USB labels, right?
Yeah, exactly. which I would assume that was nothing more than
like an Amazon warehouse.
Exactly. Burst into flames.
No, but one of the prisoners, I don't believe Boston knew, tried to get water.
Yes.
That's what we know of on the stories that have been documented.
Mm-hmm.
Another fellow prisoner tries to get water and is shot by the Confederate guards.
Yes.
He's brought back into the temporary prisoner line.
Mm-hmm.
So this man is suffering. He's been wounded. It's the summer of 1864. So hell, I dislocated my shoulder and it felt like shock set in,
Sure.
He's probably dying of thirst.
Mm-hmm.
And Boston, knowing this, knowing that the Confederates aren't letting them get water, surprisingly, he just walks right out of the line with Confederate guards threatening him and fills up a canteen of water and brings it back to the soldier who is in dire need of water at that time. And again, I've said it a couple of times, his career's mixed. And now in the 16th Cavalry, we're starting to see signs of a strong soldier.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be the common story for the rest of Boston Corbett's military career.
Yeah. Something happens in the 16th where kind of becomes a stellar soldier, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think it might have been because the men that he served with they became like his family. I think the fact that he lost his wife and child in such a, tragic manner that he never really had, even with the church, his religion. I don't think he really ever had a true family. And I think those guys became his family. And even if it was not one of his comrades in the 16th, somebody was suffering, I think that he, as the religious person that he was, and as much as he purported to love Jesus, I think that in those instances where he knew that he could provide some comfort, I think he did. And it goes further as they head further south, how much more comfort that he provides to the rest of the prisoners that are with him.
Almost Civil War weird, to be honest.
It is super
to be fair. To be fair,
because there weren't many men that were willing to do that even for their comrades.
And this temporary pen, when he comes back with that full canteen, all accounts say that he was cheered, by the other men who were there in that temporary holding location. But either way, if you're anywhere savvy with the Civil War, when I say Macon, Georgia, you're not far from Andersonville, Georgia,
Camp
which was
Sumter,
the most notorious Confederate prisoner of war camp.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be fair, the Union had some pretty awful camps, but Andersonville, I personally would not have wanted to have been there.
Sure, absolutely. We had Camp Douglas that is literally less than 250 miles from where we currently sit here in Springfield, Illinois.
No.
And not only there, but less than 5 miles from where we currently sit, we have Camp Butler. Camp Butler was another place for a very brief period of time that was a hell on earth for Confederate prisoners.
Oh, yeah. Pneumonia and yellow fever, I think, hit them hard at one point. Yeah.
Starvation and exposure to the elements. You can't take captured Confederate soldiers from the state of Florida and stick them in the state of Illinois at the end of February, at the beginning of March, and expect them to hack it. They didn't, and they died.
Tomato.
Yeah,
No.
Figure it out. But, they literally, they send them south. And at this point, Andersonville is not the 40 acres of hell, quote, that it would become.
Worse than hell?
It was a decent camp at that point. It was designed for 10,000 Union prisoners, as a transitory camp. And they very, very quickly outpaced.
Yep. By the time Boston made it there, it was still that transitory status, yes, as the word you use.
Yeah. And even though when they got there, as any other Union prisoner that got there, later on, there were no supplies, there were no food. The water was rancid. It was a bad place to be, even at the very beginning. But as Corbett and I guess you would say the earlier prisoners of the Overland campaign soon found out that more prisoners meant more suffering.
Yeah, and it swelled rapidly.
Yeah.
Past that point, as more and more prisoners
were absolutely
brought in. But any student of Andersonville should know that. Yeah, maybe not terrible for the first group that came into that stockade, but once it hit capacity and then far exceeded the intended capacity, the Confederacy just couldn't help. Even if they tried, sanitation, nutrition would have been, even shelter, even basic shelter was completely neglected. They couldn't even provide for shanties and shacks,
and that's one of the several famous pictures of Andersonville or of the what they called the shebangs.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And the shebangs were nothing more than their own coats, sometimes their own drawers.
Yeah, if they were lucky, their blankets and shelter halves, or undergarments. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So Boston gets there early, but it quickly swells. He's there for give or take 5 months, 6 months, I believe. And just within those few months' time, it becomes something from a grassy field to a disgusting mix of fecal. To be honest with you, fecal and death is what it becomes.
Absolutely. It is, as you said, and as has been said by other people, it was hell on earth, or 40 acres of hell. They had, as I said previously, the worst part of the prison camp was the inability to get clean water. The rations, the meager rations that they were afforded by the Confederate command, were no worse than what the Confederate soldiers were getting in the field. Now, Captain Henry Wirtz, who was hanged, one of only 2 war criminals to be hanged at the end of the Civil War, withheld rations from the entire prison at its height, when there were about 38,000 men inside of that compound for the slightest infractions. If somebody were caught trying to escape, or in one instance, somebody had played a prank and stolen the bridle and halter from his prized horse, he would withhold rations. And so not only were these men already starving by the time they got there, but he was exacerbating the situation.
Right. And we'll talk about Boston's testimony post-war in those trials. Unfortunately, it was dismissed, but Boston was definitely there. Now, going back to him fighting until the last bullet, going across a line to fill a canteen with risk of being shot. he's there for pretty early on at Andersonville, but as he sees it fill up and fill up and fill up, he's seeing these young men coming in who have nothing.
Which they've you have to remember also they've been stripped by the Confederate soldiers on the way down of everything they can possibly take from them.
At Andersonville, though, what's he start doing?
He becomes, for lack of, I guess you would say, a better term, he becomes the angel of Andersonville. He takes care of the sick. He gives them his rations, as meager as they are. He tries to find them clean water whenever he can. And not only that, by the time he leaves that compound, he's almost completely naked. He's given his coat, his pants, everything. He's barely wearing a loincloth by the time he leaves.
And he doesn't get out until November of 1864 on an exchange. So, I mean, yeah, Georgia compared to the Illinois climate,
sure,
quite different, but still, even October, November, it can get pretty chilly in the evenings in a place like Georgia. But he's still offering, for the most dire cases, his personal clothing to clothe other Union soldiers who are definitely suffering.
Yeah,
and what we can call that hellhole.
Yeah, he literally did everything he possibly could to alleviate. He stayed with the sick, knowing that they were going to die. He made sure that the men that died under his care, when they were brought out to the dead house, that they were recorded. That he turned over, I guess you would say, his life to, you could say God at that point, but I would say more of a defining and deciding factor in that time he was there. He was the comfort and aid to so many of people who were suffering inside of there, including himself.
Right. His early militia days with Dan Butterfield, completely, I mean, to me, that completely sets aside any possible, court martials that he had far earlier in his career.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
He became the soldier. He became the soldier's soldier, at that point. Something happened when he got out of the 12th, joined the 16th Cavalry. My God.
Yeah.
The man became a soldier of soldiers, and he really did. But either way, he's one of those few, if not last, exchanges of prisoners out of Andersonville, November 1864.
Yeah.
And it gets to that point where it becomes political, right? Where they're arguing about going back and forth between exchanges. But
yeah, the what we would call the Dix Hill cartel breaks down. And the Dix Hill cartel was a non-governmental agreement between a Confederate general and a Union, I guess you would call him a diplomat, that they came to the agreement that they would exchange one Union soldier for one Confederate soldier. Same rules as we talked about before with parole, where they were exchanged, basically paroled, and now they had to go home and be a good boy. They couldn't fight anymore.
Kinky.
Yeah. And that rarely ever happened unless they had enough.
Yeah, how are you going to prove it?
Yeah, exactly. And so what we call the Dix Hill cartel broke down. And one of the major reasons it broke down was because of the treatment of colored or United States colored troops or black troops, and the Confederacy's inability to allow fair treatment with black soldiers and white soldiers.
It's a blatant refusal to exchange.
And not only the
blatant refusal,
but the threat of some summary execution.
Oh yeah,
of
a uniformed
black
US
soldiers
soldier.
or their white officers. Grant decided that was not going to fly. And he decided to tell the Confederacy, this is over. We're not going to exchange anymore. We're not going to parole anymore. From now on, any of your men that are captured, they stay. Any of our men that are captured, they stay. Until you decide to treat our black troops just like human beings.
A Union soldier as a Union soldier, absolutely.
And that was the reason why the Dix Hill cartel broke down.
Mm-hmm.
But in November of 1964, Corbett is, I would say, extremely lucky to be some of the last Union soldiers that are paroled.
He's hitting that line of death or survive, quite honestly. Yeah.
At this point,
even after 3 months, scurvy kicks in.
He had it bad.
Oh yeah.
He had other afflictions, but his number one affliction was that he had to walk with a cane or a crutch because his right leg, we
talked about that, the paralysis that we were talking about.
His leg grew up.
The tendons. Yeah.
And he couldn't pull down his right leg any longer. And so he, in effect, was completely crippled. Mm-hmm. But he was still going about his, I guess you would say, his not just faith work, but his work of kindness inside of that stockade. However, he, probably because of his condition, and probably because of the kindness of his comrades and the guards seeing what he did, he was paroled. Mm-hmm. They marched these men to Savannah, Georgia before the fall. And they were set on steamers and sent back north. Mm-hmm. And that was how Boston Corbett ended his horrible tenure inside of Andersonville prison.
Yeah, for me, this is where Boston really shines. Yeah, right?
Absolutely.
He's gotten out. He has a discharge, right?
Yeah. There's no reason.
No argument.
Three enlistments.
I personally had a Civil War relative who got out with the simple reason of dysentery. Now, chronic diarrhea is nothing to joke about, but still.
Ass-to-mouth disease is nothing to play with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, true. Especially back. Yeah.
I agree with you, but
he has an out of the military. He could be done right then and there, easily. Scurvy, malnutrition, whatever elements are plaguing him, easy out, right? But what's he decide to do? He decides to stay with the 16th Cavalry. He doesn't discharge. He goes to a hospital
and goes back.
Yeah.
He tells anybody that will listen as soon as he can, and they'll release him. He wants to go back to his unit. And he does. He gets over his scurvy. His leg goes back down.
He's out in November 1964. We know he's back in service for sure April 1965. Yeah. So it's going to take him a couple months.
Absolutely. But I mean, compared to other relative soldiers that ended up in these large hospital complexes in Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York, he had a miraculous recovery, and especially for the afflictions that were plaguing him.
A lot of chicken noodle soup. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that's exactly what they did. That and mercury enemas.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Give this man of God, this God man, a little bit more.
He needed more mercury in his body. It was just not quite holding him there, right?
His guts aren't completely.
Oh yeah, give him more mercury and bleed him while you're at it,
and put wet bandages on whatever wounds he has. Keep that water coming.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, he has a miraculous recovery, and by all accounts, he wants to go back to his unit as soon as he can, and he does.
He does. Yeah.
He not only goes back to his unit, but he goes back into the siege of Petersburg, and they are sent back to do what they were doing before he was captured, which was you need to hunt Mosby's raiders and keep the guerrillas.
Oh yeah, before the overland. Yep.
And so that's where he is in 1865.
Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at. Yeah, he is back with his regiment. Miraculous recovery. a man of man,
maybe,
eunuch or not,
and God. Maybe it was because God came down and said, he's doing my business and he wants me, right. I want him to continue to do my business, and he was going to do it. However, I think vitamin C had a lot to play with it.
Oh, yeah. Was he taking vitamin C? Protein?
Any of the minerals, vitamins, or macro nutrients that he needed and did not get in Andersonville, they were sticking in him.
Right. Well, good thing is he was already well on his way with Mercury.
So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's
very healthy
the best
element.
Start to any day.
I get my April dates confused. The war ends officially with, that's another debate, I guess. But April 9th is when Robert E. Lee. Yeah. The war kind of goes on for a few more months, in my eyes, technically.
No, of course.
The whole different discussion. April 9th, Robert E. Lee surrenders Appomattox Courthouse. What'd you say when you were a kid?
Appomattox.
That's
I love Appomattox Courthouse.
Lee surrenders Appomattox Courthouse April 9th, right?
Yeah.
1865. Yep. By this time, we do know that Boston was with the 16th New York Cavalry. What happens on April 14th?
Abraham Lincoln dies of lead poisoning. That's the next day. Anyway, he's shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C.
I asked myself, what was the last thing to go through both Booth and Lincoln's head? Oh, he's laughing now. Okay.
I would say a thought, but
I should have started this whole episode with that. Right? Because it's definitely Boston related.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, call it what it is.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Sure.
What happens on April 14th?
Abraham Lincoln's assassinated.
Yeah. He's shot in the back of the head by
JWB, John Wilkes Booth, the most famous actor besides his brother and dad in the United States of America.
He leaps off the stage, gets on his horse, and rides off into Virginia country, right?
He and his co-conspirator, David Harold.
And going back to the weirdness of Boston Corbett is he is with the regiment that is assigned to run him down pretty much, right? Not only that, but not the whole regiment, but it was like almost by name of who could.
Yeah, these guys were.
They only said, "Hey, we only need 50. Send 50 to go chase this guy." Mm-hmm. And Boston being by this time, I think Boston was like a name within the regiment. Like you survived Andersonville, and now you're coming back to us.
I think he was.
You've earned this, and by then he's a sergeant now, right? They gave him,
another stripe.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And he, at this point, is, I wouldn't call him a full-blown zealot of the cause of anti-slavery, but I think the assassination of Abraham Lincoln to him was another breaking point.
Definitely an abolitionist.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
No, absolutely. And I think that when Lincoln was killed, I think that he saw in his death the death of what he was fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. And I think that was one of the reasons why he volunteered for that. Not only volunteered, but was relatively handpicked by.
He had to have been.
Absolutely, by his officers.
Yeah, right. So the 16th Cavalry, New York, is ordered to chase down John Wilkes Booth with orders to capture him alive, I believe.
Yes, absolutely.
And it wasn't even the full regiment that was ordered to do so. It was a fraction. I wish I knew that info. How many companies maybe were ordered? We don't know.
No, from the.
It was a small number.
Yeah, the sources. Sure. That I've consulted about basically who surrounded the barn where Booth and Harold were. I think it was just a couple companies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the the reason for the small compliment was that they didn't want to arouse suspicion. They were going through Northern Virginia and Maryland at certain parts, and those places that they were going were very, very sympathetic to the Confederacy. And any kind of suspicion that they may have aroused at that point would have been immediately reported back to the Confederate.
Oh, yeah. Hey, boy.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, they were at this point tapped by Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. And we can only assume that these particular men or this particular regiment were tapped because they were good at what they did. And so from this point, the 16th heads across the bridge into Northern Virginia, and they're on the hunt.
Yeah. And like you had mentioned earlier, only a small percentage of that regiment was sent on that mission. And weird upon weird upon weird.
Yeah.
Boston is one of those cavalry troopers who are on that mission to hunt down John Wilkes Booth. By April 26th, by this time, Booth has been on the run since the 14th after shooting Lincoln. He is held up in a tobacco barn with one of his co-conspirators, David Harold. Who was the barn owned by? It was another Garrett, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And every time I think of the Garrett farm, I think of the chewing tobacco Levi Garrett, because they were trapped in a tobacco barn.
Well, who doesn't? Fair enough.
Little raisiny Levi Garrett. But yeah, they are at the Garrett farm. They're holed up inside of this tobacco barn. They're trapped.
Right. Well, David Harold gets he gets the picture pretty quick. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Sorry, John Wilkes. I don't know what he would have called him. John
J-Dubs.
Yeah, J-Dubs.
J-Dubs, I'm out.
I'm out of here. So one of the quote unquote co-conspirators, Harold, he gets out pretty quick. I'm going to surrender. I'm done. What happens. But Booth isn't quite so easy. And so they finally decide just to light the tobacco barn on fire, right?
Sure.
Let's smoke him out.
As the Marines said in the Pacific, if you can't shoot them out, burn them out.
Right.
And that's exactly what they did. They spread hay with the help of one of the Garrett family sons around the barn. They were told, come out, or we're going to set the barn alight.
Plenty of warning, because they had orders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Capture him alive.
He was to be captured alive.
We want a public trial. Yeah, absolutely.
We want to hang this man publicly, and they spread the hay. He's warned again. Harold comes out. Booth decides, I'm not coming out. He issues a few epithets at the cavalrymen who are outside.
Should I make a joke about Waco? We ain't coming out,
right?
I don't know. It's history, right? It's history.
Yeah, absolutely. It's exactly right. If they're going to torch the barn, and Harold comes out, Booth's still there, says some things to the cavalrymen, and they set the barn on fire. As the barn starts to go up, Booth is inside. He can be seen through the slats in the barn. He's panicking. He doesn't know what to do. Corbett is on the outside of the barn, and Corbett repeatedly asks. He asks this motherfucker a question. He asks his commanding officer if he can go in by himself and pull Booth out of the barn. And he says no. He waits a few minutes. The conflagration is getting a little bit higher, and he says to him again, let me go and get him. I won't shoot him. I won't hurt him. I'll pull him out. And he again says no. Booth is again inside of the barn. He's freaking out. He doesn't know what to do. And Boston is standing on the outside of the barn. He apparently sees Booth raise his carbine.
This becomes a little muddy at this time because his testimony always stated that he saw Booth raise his Spencer carbine.
And at that point, Corbett fires a pistol shot through the barn slat, hitting Booth in the base of the skull, basically in the neck, and drops him.
Instant paralyzation almost. Yeah, instantly. For sure.
Yeah. Some cavalrymen run into the barn. They grab Booth. They yank him outside. They lay him down on the Garrett's porch, and he's still alive.
He lives for a couple of hours. What was his last words? He asked.
This is disputed. However, he asks a couple of members of the
cavalry troop,
to show him his hands. And as they pick his hands up, he looks at his hands, who are paralyzed. His arms are paralyzed, and he mutters, "Useless, useless."
Yeah, paralyzation will do that.
Yeah. And then he passes into the great beyond and into history. But Corbett made the shot, and Booth dies. Harold is arrested, and that's where we get to what happens to Boston.
Yeah, not quite so clean cut, really. He is arrested for disobeying orders, correct?
On the spot.
Stanton, if you were to read the order, was pretty specific. They wanted John Wilkes Booth alive, and that did not happen. However, it looks like, looking at the record, maybe Stanton had second thoughts, and he was arrested, but let loose pretty quick, kind of like a hero of the American Republic. What else was he going to do, quite honestly?
Sure. I mean, how are you?
Public judgment would decide.
Exactly. How, the court of public opinion, you're absolutely right. And the shocking thing about it is that he was brought back into Washington, D.C., not in the saddle, but in the back of the same wagon that Harold and Booth's corpse was brought back in, because he, at that point, was under arrest, as you said. Not only under arrest, but for breaking a major order. The show trial that the Union or the United States government would have put on for Booth, Harold, and the rest of the conspirators after they would have captured them would have been, it would have been, as they say, the trial of the century. It would have been the trial of the millennium.
Yeah.
It would have been, who knows what it would have been.
Outside of the Benteen court inquiry, right?
The Benteen court martial. or the John Fitzporter.
The
fixing of John Fitzporter. But yeah, they bring Corbett back into DC in Clapton Irons. They get down to the stable where the 16th is quartered, and from that point, he's still under arrest. And that was when Edwin Stanton shows up, the Secretary of War, personally, to basically state that let him go. I'm not going to be the one, and I know he didn't state this, but I'm sure he was thinking it, was that I'm not going to be the one that either puts on trial or puts in prison the hero or the killer of our vaunted president.
Instant exoneration.
Exactly.
I guess. Yeah.
And he was fine at that point.
Right. Either way, the Civil War is done by now. He's mustered out of the 16th New York Cavalry. The war is done. No indication that he's going to go regular army by any stretch of the imagination. But 1865 is still a very long year for old Boston there. In fact, he probably would have had at least two separate run-ins with a very famous post-war Civil War general, Lew Wallace, the great author of the novel Ben-Hur, followed by the movie Ben-Hur, right?
Ben-Hur.
Yeah. So Lew Wallace, being a lawyer before the Civil War, he's appointed to high publicity court rulings as the lead judge. One, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and two, either the conviction or exoneration of Captain Henry Wirz of Andersonville fame.
Absolutely.
And because these two very high publicity trials taking place after the Civil War, well, who's involved with both? Boston. Not only did he testify during the Andersonville trials, but by nature of being the man who killed John Wilkes Booth, he also testifies during the Lincoln assassination trials and investigation as well.
Yeah, as a very high profile witness in both trials.
No, absolutely. One thing I found interesting is actually his testimony during the Wirtz trials was actually dismissed. Apparently, everything he had to say about Wirtz was hearsay. He had never actually witnessed Wirtz give orders to conduct any kind of criminal activity, as it were, or a war crime, as we would call it today.
Sure, and that's also something that I find very strange, is that the other witnesses that gave testimony against Captain Wirtz in that trial
was held up.
Yeah, and they also had never seen him give a personal order for deprivation or degradation of the troops, clapping them in ball and chain, or putting them in the stocks or anything like that, or even what he knew to be true, which was sicking the dogs.
Right.
And
Boston even provided testimony on seeing prisoners shot at the deadline.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And it was absolutely eyewitness testimony. And that's why I said it. I just find it strange that
it was dismissed.
Yeah.
It was his middle of the head part of his hair. If you've seen a picture of Boston, I mean, come on now.
Style.
Yeah, just not cool.
Like, no, man. You're going to have to
But no,
split
his
grips.
testimony during the Wirtz trials was dismissed, which is definitely unusual for that time. However, he did testify as well during the Lincoln assassination trials, both led by Lew Wallace, who was the lead judge and future territorial governor of
New Mexico.
Yeah. Same guy, right?
Absolutely. He's the man who issued the death warrant for Billy the Kid.
Yeah. So now we're moving on to the post-Civil War years. Now, Boston was pretty popular. I mean, he was, in some cases, held as a hero, the man who shot John Wilkes Booth, along with some of his other Civil War tales, his life as a Civil War soldier and how he provided strong leadership and took care of men. And there were still those out there in the population who thought he was probably maybe a coward for shooting John Wilkes Booth. Sure. Hit or miss, the war has passed. He provides his testimony. And now he's more of a drifter out west, right?
Yeah,
does he even go back east? I mean, briefly after the war?
Very briefly. He goes back to his old hauntings of New York and Boston. He tries to ply his trade again as a hatter.
Mm-hmm. More mercury, more miasmas.
A little bit more miasmas for the soul. And he can't succeed there. He can't find any foundation. He's still doing his street preaching. He's still known as the glory to God man. But he's suffering. He's not only suffering from his years long exposure to heavy metals, but now, of course, he's suffering from post-traumatic stress.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Being a prisoner, being in combat.
Sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And he, I would say, barring his Andersonville experience, the 16th was in what I would call constant contact with the enemy, almost every day.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they took shots or they fired shots, they still had to see the enemy and report back, where they were. And so the effects of everything coming together at this point in his life were what a lot of Civil War veterans suffered. He had the
stabilization.
Absolutely. And the unfortunate thing is that he had the unfortunate, I would say, responsibility of fame after
coupled with what we would call today is PTSD.
Yes.
Mercury poisoning, possibly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything that could possibly have gone wrong could have gone wrong in Corbett's life had gone wrong at this point. And so his mental health was suffering.
And hero or not,
Sure,
know? Yeah, absolutely. It's stockpiling. Yeah.
And he, like many other Civil War veterans, decided to go west. He first went to Pittsburgh. He plied his trade there. Same thing happened. People got tired of him. They didn't want him around.
Mm-hmm.
He was crazy. And so he goes to Ohio. When he's in Ohio, does the same thing. And the play is the same, but the acts don't change.
For sure.
And he eventually makes his way, like many other afflicted Civil War veterans, to Kansas. He ends up in Kansas, and he goes there to basically escape the world. And he does. And he does fine. He lives in a cave house, which is basically, it was a cave that was a sod house.
Mm-hmm. There's a monument there, if you're not familiar.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
By the
Boy Scout troop put it up there.
Yep.
Yeah. By the time he makes it to Kansas, I think if he would have been left alone, maybe all was well. But there are still incidences out west. And this is a part of his life where, like most Americans post-Civil War, if you moved out west, the documentation is slim.
It is sketch.
Very sketch.
It's sketch, and it's not only that, but it's one of those things where you have to look at most of the stories that were told about him from young kids and their parents as apocryphal.
Right. Well, being a student of Abraham Lincoln, you have Herndon's informants, and you're like, oh, well, were these stories elaborated upon because he was a famous man?
Absolutely.
Versus being the average man. So some of these stories post-Civil War, you kind of have to look at that from that light.
Sure. And that's one of the things is that I think that the stories that are told about him, he was crazy, he did this, he did that, he, rode his horse up and down the street, whooping and hollering.
Sounds like a good time.
Yeah, right. But it never happened. He, from most accounts, was a model citizen.
Mm-hmm.
He had no problems with people coming and visiting him, and him telling his story in a godlike context about how he was told by the Lord to shoot John Wilkes Booth, because now the story had gone from
oh yeah
he saw him raise his carbine to
yep.
God told him to shoot him.
Right. Well, tomato again.
Sure.
I mean, by 1875, there were reports of him pulling revolvers at soldiers' reunions in Kansas.
Yes.
What do you make of that?
And that is well documented.
Definitely. There were multiple. You would get into altercations and just pull a revolver.
I think that the moment that Boston Corbett was allowed to leave with his sidearm from the Army was a very, very bad day for the rest of the populace, because that was his MO, was pulling his piece on people that he disagreed with.
Well, I mean, he could have sold it years ago. Didn't somebody offer to buy that revolver from him, the one that supposedly shot John Wilkes Booth?
Yeah.
But what did he say? He was like, no, I'd like to sell this revolver, but I can't. That revolver is not mine. It belongs to the government, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It would not.
It wouldn't be morally upstanding.
Yeah,
for
him
him
right.
Abscond with government property.
Right.
But I like I said, I think that he, once he got to Kansas, he was fine. Not fine in a sense that the afflictions that he had were going to leave him miraculously. But I think that once that people stopped bothering him about the assassination,
the remoteness of the American West. Yeah,
absolutely. He's on the plains. He's on the prairie. But one of the things that I find just absolutely, I won't say hilarious, but I will say that I find interesting is that in the entire time that he is written about in his area of Kansas, there's never anything written about him that would state that he was crazy or he had extreme mental problems.
You mean except for pulling the revolver at soldier reunions?
That's amongst people he knows.
Oh, fair enough. Okay.
They're cool. And so everyone who writes about him there, unless they were secondhand sources of children, or the children of people who supposedly witnessed this, there's nothing to connect him to any kind of crazy behavior there until they decide to not leave well enough alone.
Yes.
And that's where we get...
Well, by 1887, because of fellow soldiers he knew, he is appointed a doorkeeper at the Kansas House of Representatives, correct? Yeah, he's appointed a doorkeeper. Not a very prestigious role by any means, I mean, but still
enough to tell a story.
Enough to make enough bank to live comfortably, you know, at least live in your dugout comfortably.
Sure.
You're a name. People would know you, right?
Is the tightest on the prairie.
What's that?
I said my dugout is now the tightest on the prairie.
All right, right.
If there were cribs for dugouts, Corbett would have been on it.
Right. Now, this is where, again, his religion kind of maybe has a peak again. So from what I've read, it appears that he wasn't happy with a prayer that was read in the regular opening ceremonies of any other house across the United States. And either that he wasn't happy with it, or other politicians were ridiculing it. One of the two happened there. It's very inconclusive.
Something
triggered him at that time. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh yeah.
And this wasn't the first time that in now his new position as door greeter for the Kansas State House, that he had pulled his pistol. Usually it ended up that there was one of his friends to calm him down, talk him down, and get his pistol from him, or at least get him to put it back in the holster.
That's a heck of a good friend.
Yeah. In this instance, the gun was not going back in its case. He took hostages. He held them in the gallery for several hours until his former comrades and friends could get close enough to him to basically tackle him and get the gun away from him. And
pat his head and tell him everything will be okay.
Tell him his center part was okay.
You're okay.
Your hair is not mussed.
Everything's normal except for your frustration.
And your heavy metals in your blood. Right. But they get the gun away from him. The hostage is unhurt, except for the future psychological damage that he suffered.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm sure he, before the era of Sigmund Freud and psychology. But still.
And when you're the doorkeeper, I mean, you're right there at a House of Representatives, no matter what state you are. This quickly becomes a thing. This is a thing now, right? You can't cover this up. It's it's a thing.
He's arrested.
And he's put in the Topeka asylum for the insane.
The next day, he is. I guess for our lawyer friends out there, I might be saying the wrong thing, but he is adjudicated insane.
Oh yeah.
And from that point,
the law is a little quicker.
Sure.
In those days, sure. Yeah. Now I'm gonna challenge the listeners to go on and research the Topeka asylum for the insane. It had a pretty
checkered past.
Checkered past, definitely. Rapes, beatings, negligent, absolutely.
Yeah, this is civil weird, but that is
another weirdism you can go down the line of. Yes.
It's the places in Creek, Kansas you don't want to go.
Yeah, I wouldn't try it. They went so far to remove every remnant of that institution. So they removed every small piece of concrete and floor that you could imagine, just to, I guess, hide that past.
The only thing they did not do was salt the earth, just to make 100% sure that none of the horrible shit they did there could ever be brought back.
Yeah, a completely different story. But I don't think Boston wanted to be there, though, based on that information. Yes,
no, absolutely not. He, the fact that he was placed there, I don't think that his friends, obviously, if they were his friends, which I think they were, or the judge, who I'm sure knew exactly who he was, what he had done, everything like that. And I'm sure that his friends who were politicians told the judge, this is who he is. This is what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
This is what needs to happen. And I think at the time, in that early era of that asylum, I think he was put there as a way to protect himself.
Oh, yes.
Not so much other people, because they knew that he was relatively harmless, barring pulling a pistol on occasion. I don't know how that makes you relatively harmless, but
don't we all do that, though? I don't know.
For the era, when usually if somebody pulled a pistol, there was fire coming out of the end of it. He just pulled it, and I think that the judge put him there because I think he and his former comrades, thought that he could have been rehabilitated. But at that point, with everything that we know and they did not know, he was off the res. He was off the chain, as
the cheese has slipped the cracker.
Exactly. Exactly.
I hate when my cheese does that.
Yeah. Amen. But he at this point, he was put there for his own protection. But as Paul will say, here's where we get to super, super civil weird.
Oh, more weird.
Yeah.
He escapes, right?
He absconds. I would
from the
call
institution.
It an abscondation.
Yeah,
I don't even know if it's a real fucking word, but still.
Incarcerated escape. I mean,
he split.
He popped smoke.
As exactly,
Army terminology.
Or as Harriet Tubman said,
right.
We out.
Right. Someone was at the institution with a horse, and he found his way to get on that horse and just jaunt her off. And ride off.
Disappear, barring a few supposed sightings. But the last thing that was seen of Boston Corbett leaving the Topeka Institution for the Mentally Insane was his back. He was not even looking around to see if anybody was seeing where he was going. He was just gone. And from the very sparse written accounts of it, there was a young man, and he was the only one that saw him riding away because it was his horse.
Yeah, and from a documentational standpoint, he vanishes like a fart in the wind from here on out.
Thin air.
No one really knows what happened to him. Now, if you go to websites like Find a Grave, there is a purported burial location of him up in
Hennepin County.
Hinckley, Minnesota. Hennepin County, Minnesota. Wow. And this is even no verifiable evidence that he's even buried there. For those who don't know, in 1894, there was a massive, one of the largest wildfires.
We will have to check this, and if the listeners can, please correct us. But I think it's still to this day the largest loss of human life in a
418 killed, 200,000 acres plus of wildland that was destroyed, and for some reason they feel that Boston may have been living up there and was burned during that great Hinckley fire up in Minnesota. Yeah, but other than that, between his escape from Topeka to Hinckley, it's really patchy from there.
Super, super, super sketchy. And we have his contact with a former prison comrade by the name of Thatcher. Young Thatcher was in Andersonville with Corbett and received care from him that enabled him to not only survive the war, but live the rest of his life as a new immigrant to the New West. What we do know about the, I guess you would say, relationship with Thatcher and Corbett after he escaped from the mental institution is very sparse. There's no real record that I can find that he stayed with Thatcher for any period of time in Kansas. He had said to people that in the Kansas State House, that if he ever was going to go somewhere, he was going to Mexico. He was going to pull the Andy Dufresne, and he was going down to Zihuatanejo, Mexico.
Zihuatanejo.
And he,
after he crawled through 500
yards, human shit, he was going down to Zihuatanejo, Mexico to find Red, and that was where Boston was going to live out the rest of his days. And that was the black guy that he lived with in the 5 Points. You know, it's full circle, full circle.
Oh, yeah.
He literally, nobody knows.
Brooks was here.
Yeah, exactly. Brooks was here. You know, he didn't hang himself. He, as Paul said, he vanished like a fart in the wind. He literally disappeared.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where we get to.
Did you like that one? That's a good tie-in right there.
That's good. But the point that we get to after that is that not only is he's gone from the written record, except for the supposed grave in Hennepin County.
Yeah.
But we have several imposters that step forward to claim that they are Boston Corbett in order to receive his pension and the reward money that he never received from his commanding officer.
Well, he received some reward money, but the assassin was supposed to get
everything,
100,000.
Yes,
and he only saw maybe 1,600 at payout. Yeah.
And the commanding officer,
he got hosed.
Absolutely, absolutely, he got fucked. And the commanding officer got the lion's share of it, and he felt so bad that Boston didn't get the amount that he got.
So there were fellow veterans hunting him down, possibly to help him secure what should have been his.
He sought his redemption from Corbett for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm.
He truly did. He sought him out, and he didn't know until I don't know when he saw the light or otherwise, but he didn't know that Corbett was the door greeter in Kansas. And so after he had been committed and escaped, that was when he went west and decided to start looking for him. And that's where we get the imposters that not only started showing up then, but had showed up previously. But this is where, at a time in these veterans' lives of the Civil War, they were getting older and they needed that money.
Oh, and yeah, definitely 1890s ish.
Yeah, exactly. The late 1880s. And they needed the cash. And there were several people who were, they looked old enough, but they weren't old enough. And they definitely didn't serve that were trying to capitalize on Corbett's fame.
Yeah, and they weren't the height of Jesus like Boston was, right?
No, he killed a man because God told him to, and these people did not.
Right.
They didn't have that. They didn't have that connection to the stairway to heaven.
No, and right now, while I have the public listening, whoever may be listening to whatever this is, if you own 1860 Colt Army revolver, serial number 9900, I'd be happy to buy that from you for just a couple of $100. Please reach out to me. Purportedly in 2019 that this revolver sold for $10,000.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's supposedly the revolver that was used by Boston to kill John Wilkes Booth. But again, there's no proof of that, but if you'd like to sell it, please reach out to me, whatever website we're going to be posting here.
Where you saw this posted, it wasn't the same gentleman who has pictures of Mary Todd Lincoln. Abraham.
The Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The gentleman who.
The whole. I'm sorry, I can't talk to him because I don't understand facial recognition.
No, and he called you a dick licker.
He did. Yes.
He did.
Yes.
He did.
It was enjoyable. It was enjoyable. Yes. You know what? Sir, if you are
grifters,
if you are listening to this podcast, sir, they are very nice Ambro types for the period.
They are.
I'd pay $100 for the whole set.
Quality.
But that is definitely not Abraham Lincoln
or John Wilkes
or John Wilkes Booth or Mary Todd or
Ted.
Willie. Is it Ted now? It's Willie. I think he was trying to sell them as Willie.
Yeah, that's right. Willie's the one who died early. And
either way, yeah, sure. Whatever.
This is exactly what the federal government and Corbett's former comrades who were trying to contact him were going through. They had people just like this that said, "Hey, I'm Boston Corbett.
Right.
Give me money." And they went through lengths to make sure that these men were not their comrade.
Well, there were a couple incarcerated.
Yeah,
for fraudulence.
Absolutely, federally. The best story out of them is a gentleman that was contacting his former comrades in Kansas, and he had information that only they would know. And so these men,
the smell of his armpits.
Yeah, right. They knew freckles in places that most don't.
Oh, good for them.
Andersonville.
Good friends.
Friends become friends real quick. Anyway, he contacts these men and tells them that he is, of course, Boston Corbett, and he's got information that only they would know. And they decide that they're going to take their time to figure out if it really is, because, like any friends of somebody who has disappeared, they want to see their friend. And they correspond with the gentleman. He corresponds with them. There's a plan set up for them to meet in Oklahoma. By the time they get to Oklahoma, a telegram has reached them saying,
"Do they become?
I'm ill."
Do they become pen pals?
Pen pals at this point, exactly. He knows what's happening, and he's trying to avoid it at any cost, which is them showing up to his door. He continues with this charade for a few more days, and these gentlemen decide that we're going to Texas. So they hop on another train. They go to Texas. They go to this gentleman's front door. He opens it. They very quickly and very obviously see that this is not Boston Corbett. Excuse me, but they decide to humor the man.
Yeah, when a man's 6'3" and you don't remember him,
and that's exactly the point. They go inside and they ask him several questions, other questions that only they would know.
Boston, and you were never taller than me.
Yeah, and he can't answer these questions, and that's the last thing they say is that, Boston, you are a lot taller. Than we
Boston,
remember.
You are not Boston.
And this gentleman decides to bend his knees, shuffle to the door frame to show, I guess, a juxtaposition of the size of himself in the door frame, and says, "Oh, well, you don't remember correctly." And these gentlemen say, "You know what? You're absolutely right. We need to fill out some paperwork. Hold here, sir."
Hold my beer.
And they leave. And when they show back up with federal marshals.
Good for them.
And the federal marshals take this man into custody. He goes to trial. These gentlemen testify against him, and he gets 3 years in the federal penitentiary in Texas. But he was one of the more high-profile cases that they could prove, but he wasn't the only one.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah, amongst all of the Civil War veterans, for sure, it would have. I'm sure there was a lot of fraudulence. I mean,
constant.
Yep. I mean, just look at modern day COVID relief, how much fraudulence occurred there too.
Sure.
Same thing. That happens.
You know, pay for this, pay for that. We want this, we want
Absolutely.
that. And we're going to take it.
And when you're looking at a million plus Civil War veterans just on the Union side alone, you know, definitely. But because he was such a high profile name, you know, with confirmed veterans who knew him. Yeah, definitely.
The amount of money that, let's say Corbett was given the $100,000 from the reward. He would have been at that point one of the richest people in Washington, D.C. Not just Washington, D.C., but the Eastern Seaboard. $100,000. I guess any of the listeners out there can look it up on historical currency calculator, but my God, it's in the tens of millions of dollars, which at the time you didn't have your robber barons. You didn't have people that made that kind of money, except for very, very few people that funded the war. However, they were doing everything they possibly could to keep that money out of his hands. And I think that a good portion of it was not what he did, but who he was. And they knew his track record. He was unemployable. He was a pain in the ass. He was a rule breaker. He was court-martialed. Everything that his comrades knew about him that was superfluous to him, the people who were entrusted with giving him that reward said, we cannot possibly give this fucking guy $100,000.
Right.
They didn't. And they did everything they could. And that's where we get where we are now, is Boston Corbett not getting the money. But what would he have done with it if he had gotten it? I have a feeling he probably would have bought things for God. I don't know. Maybe built a church.
That's what makes it Civil War weird.
Civil weird.
Civil weird.
Yeah.